Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today, on this special Thanksgiving 2023 episode, we're going to be looking at the question, who were the Pilgrims? And Chris, we did an episode a number of years ago. It was either on the first Thanksgiving or the Mayflower. I don't remember what it was on. So we've sort of been down this road a little bit before, but when it's Thanksgiving, I guess you sort of have to talk about the Pilgrims.
Well, you do. And I think in today's society, it's important to maybe ask the question, how do you tell the Thanksgiving story? Because history, as we're seeing, is being rewritten just about every day. There is some new aspect of history, some new way of looking at it. And I mean, honestly, as we've talked about in multiple podcasts, the history of Thanksgiving is just like the history of Christmas. It's just like the history of the Civil War or of anything else that we talk about, is that it's constantly in flux because new information is unearthed, or we maybe have this new attention to history, I guess. So I think it is important that we go back and we ask ourselves, who were the Pilgrims? Because as we've shared in previous podcasts, the traditional Thanksgiving feast that you and I are familiar with the turkey and the dressing and all of the trimmings, really wasn't what the first Thanksgiving was all about. Many scholars have even determined that there's no mention of turkey. It's not
Right.
even mentioned, and so I think it is good to kind of go back and see who were these pilgrims. Why do we celebrate Thanksgiving with the pilgrims? Where did they come from? And ultimately, what does it mean for us today?
Yeah, you talk about how history doesn't change in the sense of the events, but how our understanding of it does change, and how over the years, the picture of the first Thanksgiving has changed as society and culture maybe has become more sensitive to different perspectives. And you think about the perspective of the Native Americans in the case of the first Thanksgiving, the Wampanoag there by Plymouth, their perspective and what this maybe meant to them, not just simply in the immediate moment, which they seem to have good relations at that time with the people we call the Pilgrims, but in the long term, what did this first quote unquote Thanksgiving mean to them, and how do they view it?
And I think you make a good point in that the quote unquote pilgrims, really isn't even a term that is brought to this group of people until like 200 years after, the first event. So I do think it's important to have a reminder of, who were these people? Because, right, they really have a very powerful story of bravery and of overcoming obstacles and persecution, oppression, and being true to what they believed was a proper way of living. And which is why I guess they did celebrate Thanksgiving on that particular day, because, right, they had a lot to be thankful for.
Indeed, their story goes back many years prior to the fall of 1621, when the first quote unquote Thanksgiving actually happened. How many times are we going to say quote unquote when we talk about the first Thanksgiving? But many years before the first Thanksgiving happened, these people, or at least the core group of the people we think about, the Pilgrims, of course, started in a little town in England called Scrooby. And there in Scrooby, they were attending a church, which was a separatist church because it was not part of the Church of England. And what I always like to tell students or emphasize to students is when we talk about the fact they had created their own church, sort of like a home church, and that's the church they were attending and worshiping at. That was illegal in the early 17th century. Nowadays you drive down to Main Street of almost any town in America, and there's your Presbyterian church, your Methodist church, your Baptist church, your Pentecostal Holiness, your AME Zion. There are all these different denominations and churches. But back at this particular time in England, people did not have the freedom to go to church as they believed, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. So when the government of King James the First, discovers that they are meeting there in their home, that in the home of Brewster, when they're meeting there, they start persecuting, for lack of a better term, this group of Christians.
Well, and I think it is important maybe to help our readers understand is that this group of pilgrims or separatists, even also called saints at one time, is what they were called, is that they were feeling that England, which had been this Roman Catholic nation, and had really started to change, and you start to see this Church of England that comes about. There's two sects or two different groups that come out of this, and right, even in today's I guess language, we still see people who are confusing this group of people with another group of people is known as the Puritans. And it's important to understand the distinction, as you were saying, talking to our students, that the Puritans are the ones who felt that the Church of England had strayed away from traditional practices, and they wanted a simpler faith, and they wanted to kind of go back and quote, purify the church, to cleanse the church, and to get back to an old way. That's the Puritans. But the separatists, or these pilgrims, they're radical. They're a radical group of Christians that I would be surprised today if people would be so happy with them, because when we hear the term radical and even include radical into religion, let's think about radical Islam or radical Christianity with the KKK. We don't agree with them. We don't respond to them. And yet the pilgrims, the separatists, in that way, they were radicals. And they wanted there to be a separate church congregation. They wanted their own opinions. I mean, they're basically going to the Church of England and saying, you're a heretic. You are full of hypocrisy, and shame on you. And so right here we are thinking of this wonderful group of nice, innocent people that are enjoying a meal of Thanksgiving and turkey and all of these things. But in reality, they're a group of people who said, in other words, screw the religious establishment, forget how it is. We're going to do our own thing. We're going to be radical about it, and we're going to separate from it. And this is who we are, and this is what we believe, and you're not going to stop us. And so if you look at it in that context, it kind of paints them in a different light.
Yeah, they were contrary to the Church of England at the time. So if you were someone who was, sort of conservative in England at the time, and no doubt King James the First was conservative, you're going to look at these people and go, why are you causing trouble? Why don't you fall in line? Why don't you do what you're supposed to do? That is, be a part of the Church of England, So they were definitely radicals in a very real sense. I mean, they're doing what you're not supposed to do. They're breaking the law. They're thumbing their nose at the Church of England, and that causes them real consequences. Some of them are put in jail. They're captured. Some of them are arrested. Ultimately, they end up going to the Netherlands. And Chris, what do they stay in the Netherlands? Maybe 11, 12 years.
Yeah.
And the good thing about
I was just going to say, yeah. And even then, they find out that, oh my gosh, it's hard. They left their homes, and many people, they said, if you keep moving, you're going to lose your identity as an Englishman or an English woman. And, is it really worth, for the sake of what you believe, to lose your identity and to keep moving? Because Ray, they will have to move. They'll go to the Netherlands for 11 or 12 years. But then they're afraid that they're going to have to work hard, and they don't like that. So then they decide, well, we'll pick up the pieces again, and decide to go and establish a farming village in the Americas.
Yeah. And there was really that fear of losing their Englishness, losing who they were. You mentioned, having to work. The reality of it was, when they were in the Netherlands, they were poor as Job's turkey, using Thanksgiving metaphors here. You get it, turkey.
Yeah, that's just I've never heard that before. Can you tell me about Job's turkey?
Oh no, it's a phrase I've heard before. Job, in the Bible, he was, I guess, stricken and poor, and you had nothing, and his turkey would have been an even worse situation than he was, I guess.
That's really good. I like that. I've never heard that before.
It's my Thanksgiving reference for the day. Anyway, so
I'm gonna
yeah,
gobble for a little bit.
yeah. So they do decide to go to the Americas. This is 1620. Jamestown was settled in 1607, so the British already have a foothold in North America. So it's like, okay, well, we'll move to the Americas. Their original location was north of Jamestown. That's sort of where they were aiming. They get two ships. One's called the Speedwell, one's called the Mayflower, and they actually have to team up with another group of people to just afford the journey. People they referred to as strangers. These people are not part of that, you know, separatist religious group. And Chris, I think the fact that they refer to these other people as, quote, strangers tells you a lot about how they viewed outsiders. That is, people who were not necessarily part of their church.
Absolutely, and even before they could get on board of those two ships to head over to, to ultimately where they would land here in America, they had disagreements with the investors. They were very, I mean, these individuals, I mean, their faith and their perseverance is admirable, but you can also see that they were very stuck on doing it their way, and they were not going to accept any other options. We see that there's a lot of wrestling, if you will, as far as, you supply us clothing and tools and supplies, and in turn we'll work for the company, so that we can get over there and we'll establish this farming village, and then basically after 7 years we're going to divide all of the resources, all of the money together. And yet the entire congregation couldn't come.
No.
And so you had to split up, and you've got people who basically could settle their affairs in Norway and Holland. They could go ahead and say, you know what, we're going to leave. We're going to go ahead and head over to the new, and we'll leave others behind, and we'll come get you. And so, as you mentioned, they take these two boats, and they're going to go and establish, their adventure. But Ray, what happens is that, the Speedwell and the Mayflower, both of those ships are not able to go because the Speedwell actually has to return several times because it leaks. And so as a result, you now have what was going to be two ships with everybody on it, is now going to be one ship in which you have to draw straws, you have to select, you have to make decisions as to who goes and who stays. And that breaks up families. And at the end of the day, in 1620, the Mayflower will set out with 102 of these separatists to head to America.
Yeah, and one of the families that was split up, not because of the leaky bucket, the Speedwell, but just simply because they were worried about the impact of the trip, was William Bradford, who was one of the top people in among the separatists. He would be the second governor of Plymouth Colony once they arrived there in the New World, and he would be one of the most important people. He wrote what is probably one of the most important primary sources, that is off Plymouth Plantation, on one of the primary sources on what we know about this group. They left their son John, a baby, a very toddler, a baby child, back there in the Netherlands because they didn't want to risk the journey with him. So there were people who had to make very difficult decisions. They made difficult decisions about leaving England, and they have to make some difficult decisions about leaving the Netherlands. And now you're going to cross the Atlantic Ocean in this Mayflower, which, when people think of the Mayflower, I think sometimes, Chris, they romanticize it a little bit. This is not a cruise ship. This wasn't even a passenger ship. This was a cargo ship, for a lack of a better term. They're living under, basically in an undercarriage area of the ship. They're crowded in. They don't have light for large periods of time. They're, the rocking back and forth of the boat, and lack of clean water, and some lack of supplies. they end up, I think, probably a hurricane of some sort, and they end up almost sinking. The ship basically almost breaks in half. And as a result of this storm, instead of being north of Virginia, they arrive in the Americas, and they're at what we would call Massachusetts, Cape Cod.
And then when they get there, they once again, I think we've already established kind of their ability to not do anything unless it's set their way. You know, before they even get off the boat, there's disagreements, there's conversations, there's, well, what's going to happen when we get off the boat, who's going to be in charge, what's it going to look like, how's it going to be set up, and basically we have the founding of another important document in American history, which is known as the Mayflower Compact, which will ultimately lay the foundation for the communities and government. And I just think that it's, and I don't know, Ray, I sit here and listen to myself, and I don't want to be so hard on this group of people, but I think it's so important to see that they were set in their ways, that they truly believed that their way was the right way, and that they were not going to do anything without it signed on the dotted line, that it would be done according to their specifications. And that is why you start seeing, when the exploring party gets on land and they start setting up this new government in this new area, and then they start meeting members of the Wampanoag, the native community, that we're going to see devastation when it comes to people getting sick and people ultimately dying because they're not willing to adapt.
Yeah, and it's a bad situation when they first get there, Chris. Their first governor, John Carver, he dies really early on. He's out in the field one day, gets a headache, gets dizzy, and shortly thereafter, he's dead. You know, and you got other people dying of disease and cold, because it's a very cold winter. And one of the people, interesting, and this is a fascinating story, though there's not a lot of primary source information on it, is William Bradford's wife. You know, she's left aboard the Mayflower when the men are, you know, out exploring, and somehow she ends up in the ocean and dies. And there's real question, you know, did she slip and fall? Did she jump? You know, there's real question about that. And when you read Bradford's Up Plymouth Plantation, he doesn't mention this. He does not mention the death of his wife, which has led some historians to believe maybe, you know, she did commit suicide, or he thought she did. And, you know, a lot of these people, pilgrims, separatists, Puritans, etc., would have viewed suicide as an unpardonable sin, an unforgivable sin, and a shame on the family. So it wouldn't be surprising if that was the case, that he didn't mention her. So there's a lot of tragedy during those first few weeks and months, as they arrive there at what they call Plymouth Colony.
Yeah, to the point where you have as many as 2 or 3 people dying each day during the first 2 months of land. First year of Plymouth, 102, you know, ultimately get on board of the ship to come over. And then after the first year, only 52 people are still alive. So it does speak to the hardships that they experienced. However, they were able to establish a community. They were able to establish relationships with natives, with people that were different from them. And, you know, in the fall of 1621, after they had been there, after they had started to experience some kind of life, you know, these colonists will mark their first harvest with a celebration. And it's a celebration in which you have the Pilgrims joining together with the Wampanoag community that will come together. And this is where they join a celebration of feasting, eating on different types of meat and goods. But there's also entertainment, which is kind of what leads to the story of the first Thanksgiving.
Yeah, and you know, even though there are a lot of people today who are very hard on the Pilgrims, I think probably looking at them through the lens, and I don't want what I'm getting ready to say to be controversial, but some people may consider it such. But I think a lot of people today look at the Pilgrims through the lens of what Christopher Columbus did in the 1490s, what the Spanish did in Mexico and the southwest part of what is today the United States. They look at them through the lens of some of the things that were done at Jamestown, some of the things that would later be done by the Pilgrims and their descendants in the years following the fall of 1621. And they look at this event as something of a negative thing. But I think we have to give these people props. See, now I'm not only talking Thanksgiving language, I'm also hip. I think we do have to give these people props for their willingness to include those who were very, very, very different from them. We talked earlier about how they didn't really respond well to the strangers, that is, the people who weren't among of their church getting on the Mayflower. But here, their relationship with the Wampanoag is initially very positive. Their early relationships with Squanto, with Massasoit, these are very positive relationships. And this 3-day harvest festival, I think, it's a good start to their time here in the New World. Unfortunately, things are going to go sour. So by the end of the 1600s, there's a major war, King Philip's War, between the two sides. Now it's the descendants of the Pilgrims and the descendants of Massasoit, but still, things start very well. This is a great start. They have opened themselves up to these people who are very different from them, and they've welcomed them there, and they are having a very, very good time.
And I think it all comes back full circle, and we think now about the term pilgrim. Yeah. A pilgrim is someone who goes on a long journey, and usually there's the connotation of it being some religious purpose, or there's a moral purpose of what we're doing. And a pilgrim journeys to a land that is unfamiliar, a land that is unknown. And the interesting thing is that it's about 200 years before the name pilgrim sticks, but the first baby born after the Mayflower arrived was born to William and Susanna White. And I will butcher the name, but I think it was like Peregrine or Peregrine was the name of the baby boy, which means traveling from far away or pilgrim. And so, when you start thinking about this, we see them as people who are searching for something and who are trying to find a home. And even in our context today, Thanksgiving is a reminder that all of us are pilgrims. We're all on a journey, and it's a journey that is based on religious purposes or moral purposes, or just ultimately trying to find our way in life. And it requires us sometimes to journey to distant lands that are sometimes uncomfortable. Sometimes it is scary, unnerving. But at the end of the day, we find people that we can come alongside of, people who don't look like us, people who have different religions, maybe even a different language. But together, we join on a quest for achievement, a quest for significance, I guess, a quest for purpose. And so as I think about this first Thanksgiving, but more importantly, think about these pilgrims, I'm reminded that on this Thanksgiving 2023, Ray, we're still on that journey. We're still recognizing that it's a long, windy road, one with ups, with downs, but at the end of the day, it's helpful when you can come alongside people who will guide us, strengthen us, and allow us opportunities to celebrate and give thanks.
Well, that's great, Chris. I don't think I can add anything to that, so I'm not even going to try. I think I can speak for Chris and myself in saying we hope all of our listeners have a happy and blessed Thanksgiving, and we wish you well on the road that you are on, and wherever it may lead you in the coming days. We hope you will share this podcast with your family and friends. Like us on Facebook, like our podcast on Spotify. It always helps to bring new people to the show. And we thank you whenever you do contact us and whenever you do share this podcast with your family and friends. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.